Between 1500 and 1870, about 11 million men and women were carried across the Atlantic Ocean in ships like this. These unwilling passengers were forcibly transported from Africa to the West Indies, Brazil, or other regions in the Americas, including the British colonies that became the United States. These people were enslaved Africans, and their lives on the slave ships were filled with pain, suffering, and death. The movement of these people is called the Atlantic slave trade. It was the largest migration of people in world history before the 20th century. In the 1500s, Europeans saw enslaved Africans as a source of inexpensive labor for their American colonies. European planters established plantations or large farms in the Americas to grow tobacco, sugar, and other valuable crops. As the plantations grew, more slaves were needed to work on them. At first, Europeans enslaved Native Americans, but Native Americans died in large numbers, felled by a combination of factors, including European diseases to which they had no natural immunities. Soon, Europeans turned to Africa as a source of slaves. Africans were less vulnerable to European diseases, and as strangers in this new land, they were less likely to escape. Slavery had existed in Africa and in Europe since ancient times. Most societies in sub-Saharan Africa used captives for labor. Some African kings and merchants captured people from other groups and sold them as slaves to European traders and Arab merchants.
Europeans fitted themselves into existing trading patterns along the African coast, and then gradually, as the slave trade became more important, came to dominate the slave trade as a whole.
The Atlantic slave trade first affected West Africa in the 1400s, when Portuguese navigators began to explore the African coast. Eventually, the Portuguese, British, Dutch, French, and Spanish were all involved in the trade. However, it was England's mastery of the sea that led to its domination of the slave trade, which spread across West Africa over time.
The slaves came from all different parts of West Africa. Early on in the slave trade, they came from relatively near the coast. Later, they would be marched sometimes for 2 or 3 months from inland.
These unfortunate people became part of the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas.
The triangular trade is a phrase that's used to emphasize the link between Africa, the tropical Americas, and Europe, hence the triangle. Goods, commodities are shipped from Europe to West Africa to buy slaves. Slaves are taken to the Americas to grow sugar. Those crops are then shipped to Europe, where they're manufactured for re-export to Africa to buy slaves.
Ships loaded with cloth, rum, and firearms left Europe for Africa. At points along the coast, Europeans met with sellers and struck deals exchanging these goods for enslaved Africans. Most of the Africans taken as slaves were adult men. Women were valued in Africa as agricultural workers and for childbearing. Children were not desirable as slaves because it cost as much to transport them as it did adults, but traders could not sell them at as high a price. The Europeans treated the enslaved Africans like cargo. They were locked inside cells for weeks until they were forced to march to ships that would take them across the ocean. The trip across the Atlantic was called the Middle Passage. For the enslaved, this was a horrific journey. Life on a slave ship was a nightmare. The Middle Passage could take from 25 to 90 days. At night, slaves were kept below deck in extremely confined conditions. They had far less space than prisoners transported on the same ships.
The mortality was high. 15–20% was not uncommon for people to die on these passages.
The traders saw it as simple economics. They crammed as many Africans into the ship as possible and sold those who survived for the largest possible profit. The British slave ship Brooks broke all the records for the most slaves transported in one voyage when it carried 609 Africans stuffed into a ship meant to hold 300. Men were kept shackled at all times. Even crew members were shocked by the conditions in the slave holds. Alexander Falconbridge, a ship surgeon, commented,
When I had to enter the slave deck, I was forced to crawl over the slaves. The Negroes are frequently packed so close together that they have not so much room as a man in his coffin. I was so overcome with the heat, stench, and foul air that I nearly fainted. It was only with assistance I could get on deck.
Slaves shackled together below decks often had no more than about 24 inches, with very little room and often lying in their own filth because of the way that they were shackled together.
the conditions aboard the ships were so unbearable, some slaves took their own lives as their only means of escape. Olaudah Equiano, an enslaved African who was later freed, recalled,
"Two of my wearied countrymen, preferring death to a life of misery, jumped into the sea. There was such a noise and confusion among the people of the ship to get the boat out and go after the slaves. However, the wretches drowned."
Those who arrived in the Americas were traded for sugar and tobacco, grown on plantations there. The vast majority of enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil and the West Indies, where the most sugar production was taking place. A smaller percentage were brought to the North American mainland. In 1619, the first Africans to arrive in the British colonies of North America were traded by a Dutch ship in Jamestown, Virginia. These Africans may have been indentured servants rather than slaves. By the 1640s, however, slavery existed in Virginia. Soon it spread through all the colonies. The number of enslaved Africans brought to the colonies increased as the plantation system became a more important part of the economy. By the time the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, about 1/5 of the population in America was enslaved. Not until the 1800s was the Atlantic slave trade finally ended, for both humanitarian and economic reasons. Meanwhile, though, the damage had been done. African societies had been disrupted by depopulation and warfare. Families had been torn apart. About 2 million people had lost their lives in the passage across the ocean on slave ships, and millions more had been forced to endure a life of slavery. How did the slave trade fit into the triangular trade? What factors led to the growth of slavery in the Americas?